Hi, in this video we'll be looking at how to consolidate data over remote connections. For the example, we'll have a US office that will be consolidating data from a UK and Australian office. We'll set up a dedicated client in the US office that's called the Consolidation client. This client will have remote connections to the UK and Australian offices and will consolidate the data over the internet into a Materialised query database held at the US office. The US office can then create reports over the Materialised query that's consolidated the data down from these regional offices. To start the process, let's look at the consolidation client that's in the US office. Go to Client Setup, and you can see that this has a local connection to a local database. That's where the Materialised query database is going to be held, and it also has remote connections to the UK and AU office. These remote offices need to have an application set up and open to the internet for this to work. If you need to add more remote connections, just select on Remote Connections and Add. Let's test this connection to see if it works. You can see that it's been able to remote connect to the UK office, and it'll also give you an indication of how fast the connection is. What will happen is later on, when we consolidate data, Sharperlight will stream the data, compress it, and send it to the US office. Once your connections are set up on the consolidation client, close Client Setup and start Materialised queries. When logging in, you'll be prompted to enter an account. I've chosen admin in this case, but whatever account you choose needs to be set up on every regional application server so it's consistent and has the same password. Otherwise, those regional application servers will not be able to trust your account. I now have a selection of where I'd like to start. In this case, we want the local connection, as we're building the consolidation database locally in the US. I've already set up a consolidation database, so I'm going to use that. And currently we don't have any tables. Let's start by consolidating data from the UK office. Click on New, and in Query Builder, select the mode, which will be Summary Report. You can see I have a selection of products from each office. Let's use SAP Business One for this example. Now I'll start building the query over the UK office. I'm going to select a company, which is the UK, and the table will be GL transactions. And for the data to correctly identify where the region is, I'm going to pull the company out into the outputs. I'll select the account name, and I'd like to see the amount and also the period. So just put the period in between the account and the company. If I preview this data, we'll pull it down from the UK office to the US office, and we can see the consolidated data set. Next, I'll just rename this column here, because later on we'll do the exact same thing for the Australian office. It's really important that when we're consolidating the Australian and the UK office, that the columns be called the same thing. I'm going to apply an index to this data set now by specifying the sort order. I'd like it by company, period, and the account. This data set's now ready, and I'm going to press OK. And now that the data has been pulled back to the US, let's give this table an appropriate name. So I'm going to call it GL Transactions UK and press OK. Now we have the table for the UK. What I'd like to do is clone this Materialised query, and we'll use the same basic details but change the connection so it goes to the Australian office. So I've just clicked Clone, and I'll double click, and we'll change this to AU for the Australian office, and we'll come in and edit the query. Currently, if you look at the products, you can see it's going to connection 001, which happens to be the UK office. Let's redirect this second query so it pulls data from SAP Business One at the Australian office. You can see here it's asking if we want to redirect to the other office, so I say yes to that, and I'm just going to change some of the details so it's the Australian office. And let's preview this. Now the query is ready. Let's press OK and we can close the table. You'll notice that in the Materialized Query table list, the tables will be shown as green. This is just an indication to say that the data is not coming from something local, but something that's coming from a remote connection. Now we have these two tables. The next step is to create another table that combines the UK and the Australian data. I'm going to press New again, and this time the connection will be local and the table will be the UK table, and I'd like to output all the columns. And let's just preview that. You can see that it's now feeding off the localized UK snapshot that was brought down. Let's now add the Australian data on the end of this UK set. So I'm going to right click on the outputs and select Query Unions. Select New, and I'm just going to put a comment in here that this data set is the Australian set. And if I edit the query, I'm going to now change this to be the Australian table, and I'll output the same number of columns and just say yes to this. And here's an important step. We just want to say that when we union these two companies together, we don't want any totals in there, so I'm just going to select hide the totals. And for optimization, just like we did before, let's index some of these. So I'm going to go into sorting, and any indexes we want to be built on the company, the period, and the account code. Press OK. And now what's happening is those two localized Materialized Query tables are combined into one. I'm going to call this table GL Transactions World. You see that this one's not green because this data set is feeding off the two consolidated data sets that were brought down from the remote connections. Let's try out these tables now and see what they look like. I'm going into Query Builder, log in, and from Query Builder, let's select the local connection Materialized Query Consolidation Database. From there, you can see that we have a selection of just the Australian office, the UK office, or the combined Australian and UK office dataset. Let's choose the world, and from the selection I'll output the company and the amount. Let's see what it displays. You can see that all the transactions are balancing to 0, and we have both companies. And if I output the GL account, you can now see the accounts by company. Next, I'd like to discuss scheduling. Let's close this query. Next, I'd like to discuss scheduling. What we need to do is, once every day, schedule a task that will pull data down from the UK and the Australian office, and also update the world office in that order. If I come into the Australian office, you can see that there's a scheduling tab. You can click on the Force Data Refresh button, and you'll see that it builds up a command line that can be put into Windows Scheduler. This command line will force a refresh of the data from the Australian office. You will need to be mindful of your user account details when putting in the command line. We'll do the same for the UK office. Come in and grab the scheduled command line and place that in Windows Scheduler as well. Finally, we do the same for the last table, which is a combination of the two. The reason why we need to set up a special consolidation client is that it requires remote connections, whereas the US Office application server can only have local connections. Once all this work has been done, you'll need to restart the US Office application server so that it can see the new configuration of the Materialized Query database. One more point in closing. If there are quite a few transactions that are coming from each regional office, you may want to consider delta updates. In this particular case, I've got all the accounts by period. If we come into options, you could say that once we've got the full set, that from this point on, we'd like to do a delta replace, and then choose the period, for example, and then we can provide an offset. In the case of periods, we can look at the tooltip and you can see that we can come back 2 periods, for example, minus 2p, and it will just refresh the last 2 periods from that particular office. In this way, we don't need to get the full data set again. So in conjunction with that offset, we need to come back and edit the query and set it so that it just gets the last 2 periods in the period filter. If delta updates aren't required, you can just re-get the whole data set again, but only do this when the data is not such a large volume. This has been a brief overview of how to consolidate data over remote connections.